Milk. Sweet. Milk first.
Not because I suffer fast, not because I pray and fast. No be your show, no be jazz. I'm watching. Daily, Osinachi. I'm no qua, Osinachi. One lemon, Osinachi. I'm watching. Daily, Osinachi. Mama, Osinachi.
kéré o, wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa, àwọn ọmọdé wọ̀nyí kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
Not because I suffer fast, not because I pray and fast. No be your show, no be just. I'm watching. Hey, Osinachi, I'm no kwa. Osinachi, money, Osinachi, I'm watching. Hey, Osinachi, mama, Osinachi. Not because I suffer fast, not because I pray and fast. No be your show, no be just. I'm watching. Hey, Osinachi, I'm no kwa. Osinachi, money, Osinachi, I'm watching. Hey, Osinachi, mama, Osinachi.
wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Àwọn ọmọdé wọ̀nyí kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
Not because I suffer fast, not because I pray and fast. No be your show, no be that. I'm watching. Hey, Osinachi, I'm no kwa, Osinachi. One money, Osinachi, I'm watching. Hey, Osinachi, mama, Osinachi.
Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Àwọn ọmọdé wọ̀nyí kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
Not because I suffer fast, not because I pray and fast. No be your show, no be that. I'm watching. Hey, Osinachi, I'm no kwa, Osinachi. One money, Osinachi, I'm watching. Hey, Osinachi, mama, Osinachi.
Welcome, everyone. I'm going to wait one more minute to see if we have a couple more of our panelists joining us today. Good morning. All right, it's 6 o'clock. We probably should get started to be able to have the rich conversation that we hope to have today. So welcome, everyone. This is our panel on digitization and preservation of the archives in Nigeria. And we hope to have a fairly rich conversation today. So I'm going to get started, and hopefully the rest of our panelists will join us, and I'll introduce them sort of at the end of my initial reflection and introduction of the topic to allow more time for them to join us. Welcome, everyone. Good morning. It's 6 o'clock here in the US, which is where I am from. My name is Oganetoja Oko, and I am an assistant professor of African history here at Loyola University, Maryland, and have done work in the archives myself in the past, and find this topic to be very, very important and critical. I've also had some time working with digital preservation and archiving with JSTOR through the Mellon Foundation. So lots to talk about. So in October 2020, the Lagos High Court was destroyed during the End SARS protests. And the High Court housed critical historical records dating back to the mid-19th century. This grave loss has spurred quite a bit of reflection and concern over a growing problem in Nigeria and across the global South: the preservation of historical archives and how to maintain both preservation and access to such archives. Since at least the early 1990s, an increasing share of the work to preserve historical documents has gone toward developing digital technologies which would support preservation efforts, as well as increase access to these archives without compromising their material condition. As with other areas in academic production, these efforts entail a range of social and economic arrangements that evoke unequal relations of power. There have been several efforts launched by organizations and foundations in the global North, which have ultimately fallen flat of their objectives to support and preservation efforts in the global South. They've triggered more suspicion than trust when it comes to safeguarding the patrimony of the archives, much less the livelihoods of the professionals and institutions charged with protecting them. I got to see this firsthand in my years working with the Mellon Foundation and JSTOR in the early 2000s to record and digitize African cultural heritage sites around the continent. While the objective of such a project were laudable, it was short-sighted in the effort needed to engage governments and archival organizations to build the necessary capacity to maintain digitization and preservation programs. And they also failed to provide an ongoing technical support and cultivate trust and partnership with local archives and archivists. These efforts must be multifaceted in their approach, viewing digitization as part of a bigger picture of preservation and access. I want to thank the Lagos Studies Association and especially Dr. Shahid Aderinto for hosting this critical conversation. I hope we sustain this discussion and find solutions over the long term to help build a collaborative spirit among researchers, archival specialists, and government institutions in the effort to protect and preserve historical archives. This panel includes scholars and professionals who have been involved in digitization and preservation projects in Nigeria, and we hope to have a generative discussion that will hopefully support critical efforts in this space. So here are some critical questions that I hope the panelists today will take up in terms of reflection and perhaps sustain and carry forward beyond this discussion today. So the questions I have are, what role can digitization play in a holistic approach toward preservation? What resources are involved in a robust digital archiving program? And who is responsible for providing those resources? Does digitization remove the archivist from the equation as protector and conveyor of archival materials? Or might it enhance the archivist's role? Are there ways to rethink and expand how we manage and procure and maintain the archive, especially with digital technologies in hand? Infrastructure. What infrastructural requirements must be met to sustain a robust archival program into the future? And this requires both human infrastructure as well as material infrastructure. So these are things that I'm going to be hopefully bringing into the conversation today. And I'll turn now to introduce each of the panelists and discussants for today, each of whom occupy a critical role in the Nigerian archival ecosystem. So I'm hoping to have really wonderful perspective as we continue the conversation. So I'm going to introduce you in the order that I hope you'll be able to speak. I'm going to ask each of you, after I've introduced you, to speak for about 5 minutes, kind of reflecting from your own vantage point on some of the things, some of these questions that have been introduced, and then I'll open it up to sort of manage the conversation beyond that. So the first person I'd like to introduce is Mrs. Bilikis Adebiyi Abiola, who's the director of the Lagos State Records and Archives Bureau. I also have Ms. Evelyn Odigbo, director of the National Archives in Abuja. Mrs. Medina Agumbiade, please forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your names. You can correct me if I'm wrong. But Ms. Medina Agumbiade, head of the Department of the National Archives in Ibadan, and Mr. Eke Nkemka Amadi Nana, head of department at the National Archives in Kaduna. And last but not least, Dr. Vincent Hiribaran, who is the director of the French Institute for Research in Africa, Nigeria. Thank you all for joining us today. So I'd like Mrs. Adebi Abiola to begin with her reflections.
Thank you. Good morning. Good early morning to you. It's a pleasure to be here. I look forward to learning from everyone here. Just as you said, I'm the Director General of the Lagos State Records and Archives Bureau. So we're an agency of Lagos State government that is responsible for regulating records management for Lagos State. So as you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned that we had lost, the Igboshiri High Court unfortunately was attacked. And that is actually under the purview of LASRAB, Lagos State Records and Archives Bureau. It was a very unfortunate incident, and it's something that we all really regret. We learned a lot of lessons from what happened. And we have said digitalization has really played a role in helping us to recover. In 2021, we kicked off a revamping drive that would allow, one of the things that when I came on board, we did a prospection, and we saw that one of the issues that we had was that we basically did not have a lot of visibility into the various MDAs, that's ministries, departments, and agencies of Lagos State government. So we kicked off a revamping drive in 2021, and there were a few goals of that drive. The first one was to professionalize the archive function, because we found that we were critically understaffed. Prior to 2021, we had just under 20 professional archives in the entire Lagos State Civil Service, which is grossly not enough to handle such a huge function. So we are in the process of professionalizing the archivist cadre. We are basically converting various officers, clerical officers, into the archivist function. And we're already carrying out, training and transferring them to various ministries. And we look at that to take us maybe about 3 to 5 years. And we hope that by the time that is done, every single MDA in Lagos State will have a trained archivist that will have that will be our eyes and ears and ensure that the various MDAs are carrying out the archiving function properly and professionally. The second thing that we kicked off was physical organization of records, because in order to have a success, as one thing we've learned is that in order to have a successful digitization, we needed to ensure the records are properly organized, classified, indexed. So we are carrying out a drive to ensure that every single MDA has properly organized, physically organized their records. And we're currently doing that, and we're going to carry that out in phases. And we've seen that it's actually a very important thing, because we find that one of the big issues is that a lot of MDAs hold on to records because they don't know, they are scared to destroy records, because they don't want to have an issue where a record is destroyed and then you need it later on. So we're actually now pushing out a proper retention schedule drive. So to ensure that every single record in Lagos State government is governed by a retention schedule that really understands and drives and kind of understands takes into cognizance the life cycle of that record. So we're currently doing that. And then the last thing will be to digitize the record. So we're not in a hurry to digitize per se, because we want to make sure we do it right. We've seen that some MDAs that have gone ahead to digitize have come back to us and told us that, look, they've had challenges. So we're in it for us, we see it as a long-term process. It's going to take us realistically, if at least 5 years, to ensure that we are doing proper digitization within the Lagos State government. But we're doing that. We've already started the process, and it's ongoing. And just to answer some of the questions that you had mentioned at the beginning of your talk, we believe that the Lagos State Records and Archives Bureau is actually responsible for archiving here in Lagos State, because we have it's a legal responsibility that we have, and we are the agency that is mandated to ensure that all archiving and digitalization is done properly. So that's the first question. And then you asked, how does digitalization affect the archivist role? We see it as actually enhancing our role. We want to ensure that, but because we know that in order to digitize properly, you will need the services of a trained archivist. So we are actually ramping up to ensure that we can provide those services to the various MDAs once they have started digitizing. And then you mentioned infrastructural requirements. Of course, there's the software side. You need the software, you need the EDMS, you need all that. But we also want to make sure that we have proper physical archiving done. And that's going to take us a while. So we are focused right now on physically archiving various MDAs. Within LASRAB, we have a state-of-the-art physical archive. So we've been able to, carry out the final step, which is the digitization. And we are about 50% done. And that's basically digitizing all the records that are within our archive. I think one question that I have is that, in Lagos, Lagos State was created as an entity in 1967. So really and truly, the records that we have access to are just from that time. And us, LASRAB as an agency, we've really struggled to get records from before that time. And many of those records are not within, Lagos. We would have to go to, for instance, the British Library and all those other places to get those records. And we are looking for support in ensuring that we can get those records and have them, because we have a lot of researchers, a lot of students that need these records, and they are not able to get them. So anyone that can support us to do that I would really appreciate. So I think I'll stop there for now and answer any questions that you have for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Adebi Abiola. That's wonderful, really wonderful places to start, and I definitely would like to follow through with some of the points that you've raised. Next, I'd like to invite Mrs. Odigbo to join the conversation.
Thank you very much, the moderator. Good morning, the panelists. I am, like you said, Mrs. Evelyn Odigbo, the Director of National Archives of Nigeria. And I would like to say that the National Archives is the body that is recognized and charged with the responsibility of the permanent custody, care, and control of all archives of the federal government and for matters connected herewith. And in this regard, we have been very up and doing, though our speed might not be as fast as, as may be required. But we have also, been responsible in helping and assisting state governments in setting up the archives. Lagos State is one of our babies, actually. We assisted LASRAB. We helped and assisted them to set up their own archives. And I am very happy that they are doing excellently well. Having said that, we also are responsible for training records officers, records managers. We call them records managers. By the law setting the National Archives up, we are charged with that responsibility to train records management officers across the nation. We've been doing that, successfully, and with all the limitations that we are facing. And we have our offices spread across the country, at least in about 14 states. We have our very large offices in Kaduna, in Ibadan, and in Enugu, representing the old regional settings that we had in Nigeria. And our flagship office actually is in Ibadan. That was where the whole history of National Archives took its root. And I'm glad that the officer in charge of that particular zonal office is also on this panel. And I would quickly like to, without, prejudice to any other thing, I would quickly like to go into some of those posers that you dropped when you were making your presentation. You asked what role can digitization play, in preservation of archives. The role that digitization plays in the preservation of archives, cannot be overemphasized. It is very clear, it is, because going by the example we cited that is forming the basis for this discussion, that is the NSAS protest that destroyed valuable records in Lagos State and other things. Some are natural disasters, some are even wars, So for this purpose, for this reason, there is every need for us to look the way of digitization. But right now, the National Archives, like the Lagos State, said, we have not really done much with digitization due to some factors that we'll, consider even in the course of this discussion. Then another question you asked is resources. Who provides resources? This I will tell you categorically that is one of the reasons why the National Archives has not really moved as much as we desired to move, because the resources are in very, very short supply. And we are also looking out for, partnership or collaboration with some organizations that may be willing to assist us, in this regard. And who is responsible for provision is also another question. Even though we in the National Archives we are willing, to go the way of digitization, but some of these limitations are not really making it, very interesting for us as it is. Then another thing that you posed was, does digitization remove the archivist from its work, or does it enhance their function? And as the National Archivist of Nigeria, I want to state categorically that digitization will not remove the archivist from his job. It will rather enhance his duties. And why people have the fear that if they fully embrace digitization, it's going to maybe cause a loss of job and stuff like that. I am of a different view. because even after digitization, the physical records still need to be taken care of. And for that reason, the archivist's duties and functions are not in any way threatened by digitization. So I'm looking at it from that point of view, that digitization will actually enhance the functions of the archivist. Then the infrastructural requirements, just like the resources to go into digitization, everything is tied to resources. And we're looking at the human and materials. We are also, understaffed, as it were. For so many years, I don't know, due to whether it was a negligence on somebody's part or it was, an oversight, we have not been adequately recruiting archivists. And the ones we have, some of them have aged, they have retired, some, life happened, some are dead and stuff like that. We have not been able to adequately replace these archivists that have taken their exit one way or the other from the service. So in these areas, we are looking at, when I came on board as the head of the National Archives of Nigeria, I wrote a proposal asking for a waiver to recruit. And the file is being pushed. I'm very hopeful that before long, I will get a favorable response from the government to be able to recruit, because we really need the human resource. I think at this point I should, just step down and let somebody else. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Odigbo. Let me just make sure that I have, all right, we have an audience, which is good. Next, I'd like to invite Mrs. Agumbiade, who is the head of department for the National Archives of Ibadan, to give us some of her thoughts on these questions.
Good morning, everybody. I'm grateful to be part of this section. My name is Ms. Agumbiade Medinat. I am the head of department for National Archives, Ibadan. Just like my other speakers have said, it is quite unfortunate that the country has to lose such historical documentary heritage under the custody of the Lagos State High Court in such a manner. These records are archives not by implication. They are not ordinary records. They are records with evidential value that have shaped the country's historical, administrative, and legal landscape over the years, and their sudden destruction will portend serious danger for the country, especially for the judicial section. Having said this, once again has been raised the issue of proper records and archives management in the country. Sadly, the issue of proper records and archival management has not been given the desired attention in government ministry, just like my director has earlier said. While the National Archives of Nigeria continue to sensitize the public on proper records and archives management, we quite agree that so much more needs to be done in this regard. Apparently, the advancement in technology has provided archives professionals the opportunity to create electronic copy records from the original and preserve same digitalized preservation for as long as necessary, so far the right system. However, we must emphasize that preserving this digitalized content does not mean that the original copy of these records should be abandoned or cared less for, because they cannot be replaced if damaged or irredeemably lost. Secondly, it will be like to correct the notion concerning digitalization and job security in the archival profession, just like my director has earlier said, that automation and artificial intelligence are known to be threatened by job security in most professions. However, in archival profession, it may not be so, because the bulk of our duties, i.e. the record acquisition, the appraisal, the arrangement, description, jacketing, boxing, and to mention but a few, needs to be done manually by a competent professional before it gets to the secondary stage of digitalization. Furthermore, considering the ever-growing volumes of records created and will received by organizations which eventually finds their way to the archives, digitalization and digital preservation is a continuous process that needs more staff to be executed. I will continue to support my director because we are understaffed and mostly there are not enough technological materials for us to work with. We in Ibadan here, we have able to digitalize over 200 endangered archives material. And I would like to stop here to give others that may. Thank you for listening.
All right, thank you, Mrs. Agumbiade. Next, I would like to invite Mr. Nana, who is the head of Department of National Archives in Kaduna. You're muted. Is there a way to unmute yourself? Or can the host unmute?
Okay. All right. My name is Ekin Kimka Amadin, the archivist in charge of the Kaduna Zonal Office of the National Archives of Nigeria. The Kaduna Archives, I believe, and everybody knows, is a very important facility in the nation because its sphere of influence covers the whole of the 19 northern states of Nigeria. We discovered that our collections here, covers records of colonial and post-colonial activities or governance in northern Nigeria, the activities of missionaries, explorers, and traders, and we have an enviable collection of Arabic manuscripts that we describe as a spatial archives here in Kaduna. And the oldest record of the archival institution in Nigeria is domiciled in Kaduna. It is an Arabic manuscript dating back to the 12th century. So the importance of Kaduna can be overstated. It has continued to occupy a pride of place as one of the regional centers, one of the regional centers and archives in Nigeria. So you discover for a department that holds these manner of important records, rationally or logically, that you would want to assume or suppose that attention should be given to such a department, which is not so at the moment. Now in archives, we have been able to, through our research and reference activities, continue to add value to the society, and to add pride to the region by the reason of our reference and our research activities. We continue to, the Kaduna Archives continues to be a maker of some sorts to the more intellectual visitors to Kaduna State before the advent of these insecurity issues that have just locked us and made us so obscure. And so I am proud and ever proud to identify with the National Archives, and I want to give kudos to my director because before her, I would want to see that it's like archives was gradually slipping into comatose. But ever since she came in a short period of time, she's been here, and with the activities that we have seen that has not fully, materialized. But we know that with the way that she's going and the directions that she's going, and then archives and has hope for the future. So, but here in Kaduna, we've been able to, part of our activities has been to, through our reference and research activities, we've been able to resolve several issues and disputations about boundary disputes, because this place continues to be the hub of the committee or commission of boundary dispute, because a lot of boundary issues crop up within these northern axis, and then archives are then helped in resolving such issues, and likewise, issues of chieftaincy and the rest. And here we've also been able to train record handlers in the various departments of government, even in the private sector. I think one of those, and we've been able to train them hands in the missional Anglican mission here in Kaduna. We also host a lot of excursions from students. Before the insecurity, you see students of various institutions of higher learning, whether from Sokoto, from Katsina, from Nasarawa, all over the north, coming on excursion to the National Archives. Because it's when they come on excursion, you begin to realize that not many people outside of the circle of archives or this professional circle know anything about the existence of archives in Nigeria. And this has informed either the response of people to the department. So you discover that it's only within the circle of the academia and in closely related fields that people are aware of the services that the archives renders, and I think this has contributed to why archives have remained small over time. So most people do not know that archives is there. Most people do not know the services that archives render. Even the government itself that set up the archival institution, by the reason of the neglect that they give to the institution, you begin to discover that most of them do not even know about the importance of archives. An instance is we are next door neighbors to Nigerian Television Authority, and very an instance we have a directors from Nigerian Television Authority coming around and to ask, what do we do in this place? But these are people, the same community that find themselves within the information arena, sister, disciplines of the archive. So that exists. So we also do through, like I said, exhibition. We've also held exhibitions on Independence Days, and then try to, educate the people, try to encourage people to come around, educate the people, the history of the nations, and, set up a pictorial story of, of the nation. So we have also, all right. And that is that for that. And reacting to your welcome speech on all the issues that were raised, we talk about the role of digitization, and I think it's very, very obvious the role that digitization plays. Especially, we are still a developing nation. I think we all know how digitalization also aids the preservation of records, and saves it from being lost for all times, and also gives faster or easier access to information, making the information more available and all that. So the role of digitization of the records of the archives cannot be overstated. And it's my take that the digitization of the holdings of the National Archives is an absolute necessity. Because we recognize all over the world, developed nations have come to realize that the keeping of archives is a national duty, should be the responsibility of the government. But the reverse is the case with us here in Nigeria. So that means if we have to digitize, and that means that government has to be ready to spend money on training of staff and acquisition of hardwares and softwares and all the equipment that we need to be able to carry out this operation. But unfortunately, with the scenario on ground, the government is not ready. By their body language, we can't see any readiness on the part of the government to initiate the digitization of the records of the nation. Whatever effort that has been made has just been made by the director of of archives and the archivists at all the other zonal centers. Here, there's an ongoing digitization of the record holdings of our own zone in Kaduna here presently. We are fortunate to have an industrial scan, and even though I subscribe as a person subscribe that digitization should be a well thought out and planned activity, over a long period of time. But then, just like what informed the existence of archives today is that the father of archives, Dr. Dike, he said, let what can be saved and not be lost for all time. So if we keep waiting for everything to be in place, it will never be done. So we are just making use of a little resource that we have at our disposal to see the much that we can do. And today it's an ongoing activity in the archives. We are just capturing the records collections that we have gradually. So there's a dearth of equipment, of course, because the equipment that we have here is limited. So it will not, it does not give for speed, over a short period of time. So, but then we'll keep forging on. So over a period of time, of course, we'll have something appreciable done on the ground. And also, I want to here also mention that in the course of time, I was fortunate to have been associated with Dr. Vincent Hiribarin of King's College in London, who is also a very good friend and part one of the panelists here. And he has been a very big help to the archives in the area of digitization. In 2017, we collaborated, I, myself, and Dr. Vincent Hiribarin, and the French agency in Nigeria, IFRA, collaborated, and we set up a website for the Kaduna archives. So I've even received letters of commendation from notable people like Dr. Simon Heap, so commending us on the extent of that website. And so yeah, what we sought to do was just to showcase the wealth of cultural materials that the Kaduna archives and Nigeria as a nation holds. So we just limited ourselves to capturing the simplest of the most consulted agencies and uploading them on the net, so that anyone that can, at a glance, before you even come down to the archive, would have been able to look at what we have on the net and see if your visit is worth the while or otherwise. And so that has continued to help us and put archives on a global page for that, because we've been receiving a lot of responses by the reason of that website that we have done. So that was the first adventure into digitization of the records of my zone, and that was confined to the simple list. Now when we talk about archives, the archives need money, that's resources, but unfortunately funding is not forthcoming. When you look at archives and you look at the situation whereby archives and record management do not feature in national planning, development, in national development plans, then you can understand. We are more concerned about other issues and less concerned about these all important issues. So I think we want to believe that until the people who are in charge come to an understanding of how important the archives of a nation is, that the archives of a nation are the raw materials of its history, and that if they are not preserved, then a great disservice would have been done to the future generations of that entity. Because today we are facing issues of deterioration through much handling of records. If digitization had gone on ahead earlier before this time, I think much records would have been saved. Because today, through much handling, then we're losing the records. And because of the tropical environment that we find ourselves in, it is also a concern here. So, and when you're talking about the issue of archives and causing the archivists to lose digitization, causing anybody to lose their job, I will say an emphatic no. That may be true of more developed societies, but for us here, we have not even started. So not to talk of digitization causing anybody to lose their job. Rather, it is enhancing our job. At least we are happy that at least we could capture some of these things and digitize some of these on an electronic format so that we can revert back to them when the need arises. So, and then on infrastructural development, you discover that the policy of having archives on rented apartments, it doesn't go down well, because presently what you have, the only archival buildings that are owned by the National Archives are just those at Ibadan, Kaduna, Enugu, and Maiduguri. Every other archive is on rented apartment, and that is not too good. It creates a lot of problems for the handling of the records and the management of the records. So we're also understaffed. The issue of personnel has been a very perennial problem. When the issue of downsizing, government came up with the issue of downsizing, and right, so the staff strength was reduced, and the workload on ground was much for a few hands. The situation has not changed, though successive directors of archives are making efforts to see that this scenario changes. But then, up to this moment, we are yet to see the government do something, in the light of this. Likewise, also the legislation. I think if the legislation of archive is not altered, then the department, we experience slow progress. Because when you talk about the National Archive Act of 1992, you discover that this archive, this act was raised as a bill in 1980, and it took 12 years for them to pass it into law, by which time, events had overtaken, the issues that were captured in it. So there need to be a revisitation to the present act, empowering, better, more empowering the director and handlers of archives, progress in archives. So I think for presently, if you ask me to describe archives, I'll say we are still steeping more of manual operations. We have not yet gone digital. We're just attempting to step into the threshold of a digital archive. So thank you. I think I need to stop here.
Thank you, Mr. Nana. You have raised very, very critical issues that I'm sure that resonate with some of the other panelists, but also that we definitely need to come back to in the conversation. Last but not least, Dr. Hirabaran, I'd like you to reflect a little bit on some of these questions, and from your vantage point as a researcher, and also a partner in the preservation efforts, especially in Nigeria.
Thank you, Dr. Ganeto Jaoko. I would like to thank Professor Said Aderinto for organizing the whole conference. I know how much work it takes him every year, and I know how hard he works just for us. So thank you, Prof. Let me just start by just share. If I can share my screen, if you don't mind. Let me. There you go. I think you can see it now. Okay. Yes. Okay. I will answer your questions, Dr. Oko. By showing you what we've done with Mr. Eke, who just talked. It's a pleasure seeing him. And I would like to introduce you to the different projects that we've had in my institute, IFRA Nigeria, which is the French Research Institute in Nigeria. And as you just said, I'm the director of this institute. I'm not on my own, obviously. I couldn't do all this on my own. And see, we've got all these people who worked with me, but especially Dr. Cyril Mangro-Martineau, who's here with us today. Who's the researcher for Nigeria, also Dr. Panata, Mr. Lushula Patrick Balola, who's our archivists, and Mrs. Precious Aderike, who digitized documents here with us. So again, this is all, teamwork, and you've got a link here showing you actually basically what we do and what we're going to talk about today. So we've created a project called Niger Archives. We try to answer some of your questions, Dr. Oko, and we try to basically base this project on the experience of scholars based at IFRA Nigeria and beyond, but also archivists. I've worked with archivists for quite a few years now, and I wanted to establish a network of researchers and archivists to describe first, basically, what people were the types of archives which are available in Nigeria. So we created the maps with different dots. You can click on the map, click on the link here if you want. I can see the links later if you want. And you can see the different archival repositories available in Nigeria. It doesn't mean the map is complete at all. I'd be happy to add more dots if you send me your description of the archival fonts. But basically, my first idea was to map, archival repositories in the whole of Nigeria to help researchers, but also archivists. That was the first idea. The second idea basically was to work with National Archives, as Eke just told us, but also to work with private archives. to show actually that there are different ways of writing history in Nigeria. I'm a historian myself at the start, and that's why I was interested in writing different types of histories. In archives in Europe, we will find obviously some colonial narratives about colonization, which obviously needs to be, it's not a narrative which needs to be taken into account to write the history of Africa, obviously. But also in Nigeria, you will find other narratives. You can find, for example, as the director of the archive in Kaduna just reminded us, Arabic manuscripts. You will find different ideas. That's the whole idea. So one of these ways of dealing with these different narratives is to make lists of archives available to different researchers. These lists can be interesting for all of us. Why? Because actually they don't prevent researchers from going to the archives. And that's something I've heard often, when you talk about digitization, researchers won't go to the archives anymore. Actually, if you just make these lists available, actually they will come to the archives. Why? Because actually they know that documents are available, or at least are potentially available for researchers. So here, in this case of making the lists available, we are with AK, for example, with AK, we digitized sample lists available in Kaduna. To see, we don't make documents available, but from 1 or 2 to showcase a few of them. We just give people access to what's available there, to encourage people to go there. So I see digitization as kind of incentive, basically, to go to the archives. Why do I see it in such a way? Because actually it's impossible to digitize everything. If you go to the National Archives in Ibadan, I was there last week, there are too many documents. It's impossible to digitize everything. So whatever happens, in terms of digitization, it's only a choice, a selection of documents which we made available online. That's why I think this whole debate about whether or not digitization will prevent archives from making people come to them and somehow generate income. I guess it might not be totally true, since you can't digitize everything. You can only select a few of them. You will need an army of people digitizing documents for many years to digitize everything. To give you an idea of was done in the UK recently, people counted that only 5% of documents were digitized in National Archives. It's a figure I heard. But just to give you an idea that, even in places where you think that people are digitized a lot, actually, they count for obvious reasons, money, obviously, time, but also volume of documents in general. The second idea as well to talk about, this history in Nigeria in a different way is to focus on archives of certain individuals. In the example below, you will find the archives of prominent political activists from 1950s Nigeria, Professor Guncheye, who also happened to be the first professor of Liberian studies and also the first female professor of geography in the whole of Nigeria. And if you click on this link as well, you will see listings, again, same ideas in Kaduna, you will see lists of documents available for researchers in Ibadan, in this case. You can go there to a house and see the documents. That's the same idea. So that's the two main ideas here: maps and listings to make people want to come to basically to the archives in Nigeria, to travel to Nigeria if they come from abroad. Now let me introduce you to one project which actually has been a big project for Nigeria since last year. It's a digitization of a whole fund, basically, of one political activist from Ibadan. For Ibadan, for obvious reasons, for us, we're based in Ibadan, we're based at the Institute of African Studies in Ibadan, so it was easier somehow for practical reasons to work in the city where we're based. We chose to work with the archives of a Nigerian socialist who died just before 2000, in December 1999, a man who devoted his life to student struggles, socialism, and his career took a more Yoruba turn in the 1980s and 90s. Let me show you a few pictures to show you what basically we worked with. But I think when we talk about archives, so it's worth talking about the way archives look without shying away from what it looks like. Archives in this case were not particularly tidy. Some people understatements, but actually it makes sense as well to talk about this because there's a real practical dimension when we talk about digitization. Archives need to be classified. And there's a lot of work that archivists do before this happens. And here I'd like to commend the work, of all archivists with us today, just who spend, their lives basically, looking after the documents, sorting them, and writing inventories here. And historians like me cannot turn up at the end of the process, say, oh, it's a mess. No, it's not like that. There's all the work behind it. And we organized a training session in October 2021 to sort out the same archives here. And you might recognize Mr. AK here with us. Also archivists from Ibadan were here, and also the principal archivist from Enugu with us. So it was a pleasure working with everyone, working with these archives. And we show you a few documents, the way they looked like. One poster, I told you that Mr. Olaoni was a socialist, so it was about workers' songs. Another poster, him, but also his wife, because we discovered little by little that his wife, Kehinde Oni, who's still alive today, took a very, very important part in only his work, but also was a political figure in her own right. And then she appears more and more, the more we study the archives, the more she appears, which is also a very interesting fact here. And this is the end of the project with Mr. Babalola and Mrs. Ederike here with us in front of the archives once we tidied and all that, looked after them. So let me tell you now what more interests us in this case. How could we work with these archives? First, as I said at the start, we couldn't have done that. I couldn't have done obviously on my own. And we met the son of Olaoni, called Dapo Oni, thanks to Dr. Saeed Al-Husseini, who works for the Center for Democracy and Development, but also with my colleague, Dr. Cyril Mambo-Martino, from Nigeria, and Dr. Shola Olorunmi, who's based at the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ibadan. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that they have a lot of contacts which made this possible. I didn't come, as a foreigner with all my money and say, oh, I want to do this, and that. No. It was people asked us basically to work with these archives, and that's how it happened. Basically, it wasn't me just saying we should do this, we should do that, and that's the dynamic which happens a lot if you've got foreign researchers like me. Definitely. Something else, I wanted to make sure as well that we worked within the limits of Nigerian law. So we asked a copyright lawyer called Mrs. Victoria Onyagbako to ensure that we would have a good agreement which would leave the copyright to the Oni family, basically. My institute did not appropriate the copyright. We did not, we just moved the documents, digitize them, to sort them first and digitize them, but we did not, the copyright still remain with the Oni family. We just wanted to make sure that people were aware that documents would be digitized in the first place and little by little made available online, which is a different process, only to researchers without any financial income for my institutes. So that's something which was very clear, which I stipulated in the document. I will personally, and my institute will not make any money out of this. So that's very important, obviously. But obviously there are some other problems linked with that. I told you the fact I'm a foreigner turning up here and said, oh, this is what we can do. So this is what can happen a lot in the whole of that's the history of 20th century Africa. Somehow here I'm talking about somehow it's not just about digitization. There's the myth of the white savior, i.e. me. He applied to the digital world. And I guess it's my own position compared to Nigerian actors in this case. How do I work with the government, with the National Archives? How do I respect different, all these different constituencies? And how do I work, in a balanced way in the country? I've been part as well, of different international programs for safeguarding and digital heritage. So I'm talking about the British Library and the Archives program, but also the Modern and Archives program of UCLA, which is also an important one. I'm part of it as well. And somehow I'm very much aware that there's this image that science can solve everything. That's digitization is there to save us. And hence the quote in the title of my slide. From Peter Lim, 21st century missionaries carrying out Bibles with scanners. And that's my point, basically, that there's this whole thing that technology will save everyone, and African archives in particular. And in the end, the question which deserves to be asked is that who benefits from these projects? Is it just me? Let me tell you. Next year I'll go back to London. I'll go back to King's College. I will teach, and I will use this material. My students will use this material to produce research based on this. But is it just that's the aim? Is it just for me? I hope not, obviously, since we were asked to digitize only the archives first by Nigerians. Also, as Mr. K tried to raise a little bit, we try to work together But still, it's a question which deserves to be asked, because if I only do it for myself, or if I only do it for, for European or Western institutions, it might be pointless if Nigerians cannot use it themselves. And here, that's the question of why do we digitize in the first place, and who for? If it's just for me, well, not worth it. If it's for everyone, well, that becomes much more interesting already. I'd be happy, obviously, to answer quite more questions about this. A few other problems to show you that the kind of to conclude very quickly, because I imagine running off time very soon. About that we thought about different issues here. The question of language. Myself, as you can tell, I can express myself in English, but the thing is that somehow some of the documents I dealt with were written in Yoruba. 5%. That's a personal estimate here. I've seen a lot of documents. Maybe less than 5% now, I would say. But am I just using English as a kind of as a language imported from outside of Africa for the reasons we're all aware of, just to again reinforce this kind of a white domination on the digital world? Maybe not. That's a question which deserves to be asked. Who's also behind the classification scheme? I told you we sorted the archives and we classified them. And that's very important to let you know that first we had someone who did important work on this. His name is Emeka Ogu, who worked with these archives. And then he was followed by our colleagues, and Mr. Eke was there, obviously, but you've got also the principal archivists, of Enugu was there, Yusuf Saki, and some staff member as well of the National Archives in Ibadan. So I made sure that it wasn't my own thinking behind it. That's which classify the documents, which imposed the categories to the archives, but which was made it possible. Clearly, what I noticed is all this classification system was inspired by British practices here. Clearly, there's still the legacy, which is very, very, very clear, and that's what we saw. When we did that as well here in Nigeria, when we digitized our own press cuttings, I discovered that we're using a system inspired by the Library of Congress, which was quite interesting as well, obviously, but that's a whole, that's whole, so it's a whole way of thinking I wanted to touch upon, basically, is which language would you use, what kind of classification do we use as well? And finally, but not least, there's another issue here. Where's the data going to be hosted? The maps, Google Map I showed you is on Google Map. Definitely not in Nigeria, maybe in California, but who knows. WordPress sites are hosted abroad as well. Where will be the scanned documents? I told you that my project, Nigerian Archives, was funded by my institute, so it's French public money, it's state money, basically. So it's a French taxpayer paying for it. For the moment, it's hosted on a website hosted on a server in France, but the data still belongs to Nigerian people. That's true. And there's an obvious problem, basically, of data sovereignty here. And I tried to work with this, but there's the price, of this, electricity, internet access, or servers, no for me to do too much about this, but clearly we are facing a lot of problems here which can be, I hope, which can address today. But let me conclude with just saying this, that, I hope I've asked a lot of questions today. I wanted to show you basically how we worked here for Nigeria. We are obviously open to discussion. We're not trying to say that it's the best way of doing things at all. And I hope that the conversation will be good today. So thank you, and yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hiribere, and I think you hit on exactly the challenges, questions, problematics that arise from these types of projects, and indeed the kinds of collaborations that have come through in the past. And I think it's really critical that Nigerian archivists, scholars are in the room at the table, determining, deciding, engaging how to move forward and to kind of advocate for the kinds of resources that are necessary in order for Nigerians to be in control of their cultural but historical heritage. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A that I think will be important for us to touch on some of the things, the threads that have been sort of offered by each of the panelists. So I want to bring those in, and then kind of come back to some of the issues. I found patterns in all of the way that each of the panelists' questions that have been raised that I think are really important for us to distill before we depart today. I should also mention that part of the reason why the classification systems tend to be British or through the Library of Congress is precisely because the folks who are funding the trainings, the preservation efforts, are being funded by the Library of Congress, for example. I actually participated in some of those trainings back in 2006, 2007, and that is very problematic, and it's often a question that doesn't get asked. It just happens, right? And I do think it's critical to raise these kinds of questions. So one of the questions from the chats, first of all, is it possible to share some of the links in your presentation, Dr. Hiribaran, so that folks can follow those links? Sure. And then secondly, a really good question, would the National Archives and or IFRA be open to hosting an online seminar to teach us the process of preserving our own archives in a similar vein as the ONI project? Also, would you be open to sharing what this project cost? I don't know who asked the question specifically. It's just BF, but I think it's something to, think about.
Would you like me to answer?
Yeah,
actually,
please.
Okay, thank you. Yes, organizing trainings, yes. I just done one yesterday at Ohio State Library with someone who worked with, there, Mr. Ogeokafor, and that was a great training. So I could do one online, definitely. As for the funding, well, it depends on what you want to do for the moment, obviously, to see what it's like, so I can't promise anything, obviously. So yes, but yes, training, definitely, and maybe more, yes.
I think it's interesting, just to kind of piggyback on that question, often these training programs require advanced preparation, right? Making sure that you have the right professionals in the room, but also where's the funding coming from? And then how do you sustain these digitization projects, much less the preservation projects? I mean, providing the kinds of materials that are necessary to actually preserve the physical documents is one aspect of it, along with hardware, software, electricity. All of these things have to be part of that funding. And then how does it get sustained, right? I think that's the biggest challenge, is once a project is established, is it possible to sustain it over the long run in Nigeria, especially where infrastructural issues are a kind of recurring issue? Anyone else like to contribute to that question? Okay. Another question. I'm not sure if we are to ask. Yeah, yes, please, you can ask questions. I don't know if you can raise your hand or if you just want to type your question in the chat. We're definitely open for questions. Another one, thanks everybody. How do you deal with the issue of transferring equipment to the archives after the project when the funding comes from the global north? This is again the question. I am coordinating a digitization project funded by a German institution, and our biggest problem is to find a way to be able to leave the scanners and laptops at the archives after the project is completed. Anyone like to take up that question?
I think we've got Dr. Olia Wen, who's currently the holder of a British Library and Archives Program grant. Maybe he could help us, with this. Otherwise I could answer the question.
I don't see, hold on. Are participants able to speak? I'm talking to the host right now. I don't have much control over allowing people to actually speak beyond the panelists.
Yeah, yes, they can speak, but they have to say their first and last names and affiliations. We're not going to allow them to use any nations. And they raise their hands.
Okay. Dr. Owen? We'll wait for you to, okay, mic is not, there's a problem with the mic. We'll come back to you.
No, we can't hear you.
We can't hear you, no. We'll come back to you. Hopefully that problem can be resolved. A question from, okay, there you go. Your hand is raised.
Okay.
Yeah, there you go. Yep.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. And thanks for putting this panel on. I think it's really, really important and vital. And it's really nice to see so many prominent archivists here, because without the archivists, there can't be historians. And I don't think we spend enough time talking about the work that archivists do. I've interacted with some people on this panel, and Mrs. Adibo, looking forward to also interacting with you more, because we've all seen the work that National Archives is doing to really reoccupy the important space. I think it's really, really key. So kudos for that work. I just think, yeah, just to kind of pick up on what Vincent has said, maybe I have a less negative experience of starting to work on this project than maybe Dr. Oko was saying in the introduction. And I think partly that's because of some ways that we approached it, and some of them mirror. We took advice from some people, and we've spoken to Vincent before, and we're just starting up a project. So definitely we're going to engage with more of the stakeholders, including National Archives. But it's working with Nigerian Railway Corporation on their archives of technical drawings and such like. And those are really endangered, partly because they're vast, partly because of storage conditions, partly because also some of them are duplicates that were held elsewhere in the world. And I just want to underline that destruction of archives is not something that just happens, you know, in Nigeria. Unfortunately, it's in the UK, a lot of archives were transferred to what was going to become a museum of the British Empire, and were just thrown out when the museum project failed, improperly stored. So some of them, you know, the only copies that exist in Nigeria. But I think what's been really key is about 5 things in having a more positive experience so far. And as I say, it's just at the outset. One is that it's lodged with a collaboration between NRC and Legacy 1995, which is the membership NGO that runs the Nigeria Railway Museum. So it's already kind of embedded in an existing collaborative relationship. 2 is that it incorporates the people in charge of the drawing offices in NRC as part of the, you know, right from the beginning. I think 3rd is that we took advice from, especially in NRC and, you know, related fields, from what their priorities were, because it's vast, right? It's so vast. You know, what can you even do? So, you know, what would people want to prioritize? And different users globally in Nigeria have different priorities. And then I think in terms of the practicals that you said about sustainability, there is 2 things. One is that the Endangered Archives program actually has a stipulation that you have to leave the equipment with the custodian of the archive. And I think that's a great thing. So all of this equipment is going to be lodged with Legacy 1995 and NRC so that people can continue using it. And in fact, very interestingly, the demand that they're already showing is, well, we can even use this stuff to archive more recent things that we're doing now, to kind of reawaken, you know, how do we digitize what we're even doing now to create kind of archive of the present. But I'm sure that's something that National Archives would even be able to help orient them more with. And I think the other one is just overtraining. So what we went to design was a training program that had about maybe 20 or so participants, even if we're going to end up with a team of 6. And just to create extra capacity. It's been really interesting. Since we started talking about it, people have been coming out of the woodwork, and you talk about Nigerian funding for these things. Of course, National Archives, you know, relying on government budget, and they're saying what they have is already not equal to the need. And then there aren't just huge funding foundations in Nigeria funding this stuff. But what is interesting is some families, like families of prominent musicians or architects, saying, well, we have a little bit of family money we can collect between family members, you know, here and around the world. And can we just, you know, there's this stuff, we don't want it to disappear, you know, and just being able to do these things in small dollops can sometimes go a really, really long way, you know. But I think just to foster that thing that there's demand out there that people want to do this even in their families. I think my biggest suggestion to global funders, though, would be academic funders who are funding collaborative academic projects in countries like Nigeria should also have more scope in that funding. That, look, if you're coming to use National Archives in Kaduna, say, there should be some funding line that you can use with National Archives to help digitize maybe the collection that you're using, because so that you're not just using, but also, building at the same time and building collaboratively. I don't know if the archivists present think that would be a good idea, but I would love to hear back from the panel on what they do think would be a good idea. And also on my personal interest, which is how to get these things used more once they're created as resources. Who should we be reaching out to that we're not yet? So really interested in that, but thanks so much for the panel.
Thank you. Thank you for your thoughts and questions. Anyone want to take up some of what Mr. Owen has raised? I think these are questions that are hard to answer, right? Yes. Obviously, yeah.
Hello. My name is Sean Williams. I basically posted my question in the question section there. Mm-hmm. Yes, so it's basically about digitization rather than digitalization. I mean, like I went through the PDF files of the work done by Dr. Hiribaren, and in some cases, I know it is search enabled, but not in all cases can it return search results because some of the typeface are now blurry and the find and replace functionality cannot bring back results for us. So is it also possible, at least maybe, to also consider digitizing some of the finding aids rather than just digitalizing them?
Yeah, I think that's a very critical aspect of the digitization process. In addition to actually digitizing the documents, digitizing the finding aids are really critical for people to even discover what is in the archive, much less entice them to come to the archive. I think that's a really critical piece. What's necessary to be able to enable that, however, is very robust metadata work. So in addition to collecting the documents, information about those documents also need to be classified and categorized in order to be able to find the documents and use the documents and search the documents for that matter. So quality of digitization, and as well as the really critical metadata work, should be part of the training for archivists who are working with the materials, but also especially the digital materials. Mrs. Adebi Abiola, want to add?
Yeah, I was just going to respond to Mr. Owen's question.
Yeah.
I wanted to take some moments to collect my thoughts because it's very interesting. It's a very meaty question. And I think for us, it's at Lagos State Records and Archives Bureau, we've seen that there's a lot of information, a lot of historical knowledge out there, but we've struggled to get people to actually trust us, to give us access to their historical records. So we've gone to families and we've said, look, your family has contributed quite a lot to history. Would you mind if we take some of your documents, for you, and we can scan them because we do have scanners. Just let's have that so that it doesn't get lost. But it's been a challenge. There was an incident recently. There was a very old gentleman that had a lot of information about Lagos State. Fortunately for us, he was very kind and he allowed us to come in, but we basically had to say, look, we're going to help you organize your papers. So it had to be kind of like we had to provide a value to him and say, look, you have a lot of papers. We're going to help you organize your papers. This is amazing. We don't want it to get lost. And but can we take them to our office? Because we had to take them to our office to get them to be scanned. And we had to kind of, get through that process. But unfortunately, and I guess fortunately for us, because we got a lot of documents, within a month, he passed away. So imagine if, and God rest his soul, because what we got from him was really, very priceless. But what I'm just trying to say is that there's so many people that have history, that have knowledge, that have records that are not aware that we, archivists exist for this purpose to help them to store their documents. So that's, for us, is a big thing. And we are thinking of having some kind of drive, awareness drive, so that people can learn that, look, if you're getting older, you're 70, you're 80, you can actually give us your papers to store for you. So that's one thing. Then I think another thing that I've noticed is that we all work in silos. We have different people in the historical, we all work in silos. People are building their own personal deposits of history. And it's very frustrating because we're trying to see how we can make sure that this history is available to everybody. But there's some, we have some people that have their papers, they're keeping it, and it's private. They don't want anybody to have access, and it's, we're like, look, we need access so that everybody, because if we can bring everything together, we can all have access and we can build something that is huge, because if without that, it will be terrible. So, but there is a limit to what we can do. I mean, we can't force people to do things if they don't want to.
Right.
Yeah, so I think, I really think equipment for me is like the least of my worries, because scanning machines, I don't think they're that expensive. We can all find money in our budgets to buy them. It's getting people to give us the records, give us the data, and trust us enough to see that, and I wish there was a law that forced people to do that, because that would make things actually much more efficient. And then finally, like I said at the beginning of my, when I was talking, is that a lot of the records and the data is not even here in Nigeria. It's the colonial powers, the British, the Dutch, the whoever. So we actually need to have a bridge, to connect us to those people, to give us the data, give us the knowledge, because that is the way we can actually become, because like I mentioned, somebody mentioned students, Dr. Vincent mentioned his students. We have a lot of students here in Nigeria, in Lagos, that want to do research, and they cannot do the research because they don't have access to the data. They can't go to these countries. They don't know where to go. So I think we need to really solve all those issues for us to really have some movement. Thank you.
All right. Mrs. Agumbiade, you want to add? You're muted at the moment.
Okay, ma'am. As regards the digitalization of this simple list, National Archives Ibadan, as the zonal head, has deployed an open source software database designed by ICA, International Council on Archives, in collaboration with the Artifactual Systems Limited. An actual database is presently used by over 100 archival institutions globally. Database does not only present us with an opportunity to have global presence, it's also an archival tool that gives us complete ownership and control of the electronic content hosted online. Amazingly, with the software database, we can describe, update, and edit our findings online at real time with little or no third-party involvement. So the software database meets the ICA archival standard and record accession and description for easy accessibility. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a good question in the chat here from Dr. George. She's interested to know about the nature of the relationship between branches of the National Archives or state archives and the library science programs in the national universities and state universities. So can anyone speak to those relationships? And what can the archives do to create a pipeline of archivists for the civil service or through the civil service, even for private institutions? And final question has to do with material culture. Do objects get preserved by archives or only documents? There are patterns beyond the geographic to what gets collected in Nigerian archives: gender, language, city versus urban, political versus social history. These are all things that impact what gets preserved, who gets preserved, and whose voices get get maintained through time. So I'm sure we can't answer all those questions, but maybe we can speak to the relationships between these archives. Also to Dr. Hirbaran's question about who funds these archives and how the ecosystem sort of gets set up is set up in Nigeria. We've lost the head of the National Archives who could probably answer that question, but yeah, Mr. Nana, yes, please. You're muted at the moment.
I think I just want to just chip in something on the relationship of between archives and the library, and we all sister disciplines in the information environment, and experience have shown that we cooperate. We have a good relationship between the archives and the library. When we need information, we revert to them. When they need information, they come to and I think the Society of National Archives is one umbrella body, that carries whether you're a librarian, a record manager, the archivist, and so we all on that platform. So we recognize, and so I think there's a good relationship existing. Just that in terms of development, but I would want to think that the library, by reason of awareness, by reason of I don't really know, interest of the government in it, or the way I don't know. So I think the library, by the reason of the association, they have a strong association, so they are making better progress and assessing funds, that assists them to make better progress than we here in the archives, because it's difficult for us to assess the kind of funds that library assesses. So it's difficult for us to make much input or influence activities around us in the nation. So as per a relationship, we have a very good relationship between the library and the archive. And there was one other issue that Mrs. Abiola raised. I just wanted to chip in a little. It's about she was talking about access. She wished there was a law on ground that would get people to release their records to. I think that the problem has been there, even in the government establishment. When you look through the National Archives Act, you discover that it does not have much bite. So there is good, but implementing it becomes a problem. And there's a provision there, the advisory council. So if these advisory councils have been active, then it is advisory council, because the function of the advisory council is to advise the minister on all matters relating to records and archives in particular. So if the advisory council have been up and doing, I think would have gone a long way. Such laws, even outside of the act, would have come into a place for us to have. So, but I think it's on record that this advisory council, I think it's been a long time that they met. So they don't meet often. So they've not made much progress. So they've not impacted on this aspect of the access to records. Because what she's experiencing, we also experience in archives. Even they go to the government department, it's difficult for them to release their documents to us. So that brings us to that issue that the Nigerian bureaucracy must begin to accept that open public archives are a necessary element of democratic governance. It doesn't help shrouding everything in secrecy that ought not to be secret. So I think that is what has given no, not really what has given it's complementary what has given also rise to this unfortunate incident with the courts in Lagos. It all boils down to people not understanding the importance of archives. That's on the part of the NSAS protesters. But when you ironically look at our government too, you discover that by the reason of the issue of fraud and secrecy, you discover that more government establishments, more records, administrative records, become the victims in the cases of fraud. You discover government establishments where people are not residents, they don't cook, they don't iron, there's nothing that they do there, gets burnt more than residential buildings where people live and they cook and they do all manner of things. So thank you.
I think that's a really critical element, and we're running out of time, so I'm going to start wrapping it up. But I think you make a really good point, Mr. Nana, that a large part of the National Archives issue, and I think this speaks back to Zabiola's point, which is really just getting people to trust their documents with the archives, but also building a culture of documentation and records keeping. And it's interesting because this is I think it speaks very much to the heart of sort of the politics of archiving, which is to sort of render for the public record the activities of the government itself, in terms of being able to not only track its history but hold it accountable to its citizens. I think that's a really good place to stop. I'm just going to double check that I'm not missing any specific questions here. Yes. Okay. So I think we're all good. I want to thank each of you today for taking the time to speak with us and to help think through these questions. I hope that this is just the beginning of more sustained conversations among ourselves, but also amongst the scholars that are participating in the conference today. I think there's another panel that's coming up talking a little bit more about the impact of the archive and the loss of archives coming up this week, I think on Friday especially. So thank you very much. It was a pleasure to speak with each of you today, and I wish you well for the rest of the conference.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Oko. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye. No, I'm going to sing. Okay. Bye.
Hi. Goodbye. No, I lost some of it. My network went bad.